Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Lex van Geen. I'm a geochemist and a research professor at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And Peter Schlosser, who is the Associate Director of the Earth Institute, asked me to help him organize these sessions, seminars in our Sustainable Development Series. The theme today is water management in agriculture. You all have seen the program, and I think we have a nice combination of presentations by experts in the field. The idea is that we're going to have 5 15-minute sections, more or less, and if possible, it would be better if you limited your questions to points of clarification, points of information, and then we'll have a discussion, a panel discussion at the end of the 5 presentation on whatever you may wish to ask. So the sequence of speakers is as follows. First of all, Manu Lal is going to present his perspective on irrigation efficiency in India, China, and the US. Professor Lal is in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering at Columbia University. His presentation will be followed by a presentation by Holly Michael, who traveled from the University of Delaware, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Geological Sciences there, and she's going to present us a really unique model, a hydrological model and geochemical model for the Bengal Basin. And she will use this model to tell us something about the potential impact of irrigation pumping on the distribution of arsenic in groundwater aquifers in that part of the world, a problem some of you may have heard about. After Holly's talk, we're fortunate to have with us John Duxbury, who traveled down from Cornell and is on his way to Bangladesh tonight, in fact. John is a professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences, and he's going to tell us something about water management, novel ways to manage water use in rice paddies in Bangladesh to reduce arsenic toxicity to rice. After that, we have our own Vijay Modi, who is a professor in mechanical engineering at Columbia. And he's going to tell us about an interesting project he's carrying out in Gujarat that involves water metering, clearly another issue relevant to water management. And then at the end of these presentations, Manu Lal is actually going to come back and tell us about something which is somewhat related. It's the use of tensiometers in some rice paddies in Punjab and how they can be used to use the water in a more efficient way. So I'll invite Manu to start first.
Okay, thanks, Lex. So when Lex asked me to do this talk, he wanted me to give sort of an overview to get things started, and that's the flavor of what I'll talk about. And the basic idea I'll try to convey is that we'll be looking at issues related to irrigation for agriculture. Basically, the idea is that we want to promote food security, and water plays a major role in that. But in the process of playing that role, we are ending up with negative effects on the environment in various places, partly because of groundwater depletion and partly because of pollution of both ground and surface water sources. So that's sort of the story that I'm going to try to develop, and hopefully that'll set up the talks that come after that. So starting out, this is a slide which I pirated from Professor Kasman at the University of Nebraska, who presented an overview of this sort for the National Academy a few years back. Essentially, what you're seeing is rice, wheat, and maize on the top frame, and how the yields of each of these has increased over time in different countries. And the point he wants to make with this is that these increases have been due to various technological innovations, some of which include irrigation, which is the subject for today, but by and large, these are plateauing out. And what that is doing is exhibited in the lower frame here, And the idea that's being shown there is that as people see that the yields in each country plateau out at relatively different levels, they start increasing the cropping intensity, which is the frequency with which you plant, and they also start increasing the land area that is irrigated. So the irrigation is showing up in that sense as a major thing. The bottom right shows a different view of that in a way, and I don't see Professor Pedro Sanchez here because I was hoping to hit him with this. And the reason is that he often argues that even in the United States, most of the land is rain-fed and not irrigated. And the yields for rain-fed agriculture are comparable to that of irrigated agriculture. But if you look at those two graphs that Kasman presents from Nebraska, what you see for maize and soybean is on the x-axis is the yield realized, and on the y-axis is the coefficient of variation or the variability associated with that yield. And the blue dots are all irrigated agriculture and the orange-green dots are all rain-fed agriculture. And the point is made very clearly that if you are in the very top end performance of rain-fed agriculture, yes, you get close to irrigated yields, but otherwise you're far, far away from it. So this establishes the motivation pretty clearly, I think, as to why people are going for more and more irrigation in places as they have increasing food requirements. So this set of graphics is now taken from a paper by Peter Dahl and Siegfried Siebert from 1995. There are newer versions of some of these things, but not all in one place, so I'm sticking with this one. So what you see on the top graphic is the distribution of irrigated areas around the world. And what you see that is remarkable about this sort of a graphic is that these are not uniformly distributed around the world. They are concentrated in a few places, which then suggests that if you start exceeding the average annual rainfall or average annual recharge into groundwater in the case that people are using groundwater for irrigation, those places will start preferentially having problems associated with this. And what you see is that largely these areas are concentrated in China, in India, a little bit in southeastern Australia, and then in the Midwestern and Western United States. Okay, so those are the hotspots in terms of thinking about irrigated agriculture and its issues. The table on the right bottom gives you two pieces of information, one which we won't worry about right now, which is the cropping intensity, and the second is the irrigation efficiency. The reason I bring that up right away in the talk is that if we want irrigation to support us to get higher yields, which is sort of the idea in a more reliable way, but we don't do it very efficiently, then there is an opportunity to increase that efficiency and get a little bit more mileage out of it instead of planting larger and larger areas, which from an environmental perspective we are not happy about. So I've highlighted Canada and the United States, and then East Asia and Southeast Asia there, and right above that is South Asia actually. So the difference that is shown there is that the irrigation efficiencies reported by these people range from 0.3 to 0.7 or so, okay? The question is, what does an irrigation efficiency actually mean? Because if you read some other literature, you might see numbers closer to 0.1 to 0.15 or 0.2. So what's the difference between those two? And the difference primarily is that the people who report the much smaller numbers are talking about the ratio of the water actually transpired by the plant to the total water applied at a particular field. And this group here is reporting numbers at a river basin scale. And their idea is that if somebody is over-applying water in a particular field, maybe that goes into the ground, it emerges somewhere else, and so it's available to you, so you haven't lost it. And we'll discuss that a little bit as we go along. Another frame on looking at irrigation is that using the crops that are actually grown and the efficiencies with which, at the basin scale, they are being watered, Peter Dahl and Siebert produce the map above, which shows the net irrigation requirements as a function of location around the world. So this is the amount of water you would on average apply each year using 1960 to 1990 climate data if you wanted to grow those crops in those places. So what you see as hotspots that emerge are essentially the same places, because if you have much higher amount of irrigation and you're growing crops there which require a lot of water beyond what's available, the same areas basically pop up. And what you see is that the Indo-Gangetic plains actually dominate that story. Okay? And one reason for that, many of you, I'm assuming, have some familiarity with what's going on with groundwater in the world, and if not, I'll just hint at it very quickly, is many people now talk about the Yellow River or the Huanghe in China, where groundwater has been depleted significantly, and the Yellow River in fact vanished for a goodly period, and they are in the process of restoring it. But if you compare the bottom two figures, you see that if you look at the potential evaporation for the crops in the Huanghe versus the precipitation in the Huanghe, they are almost peaking at the same time. So the differences are associated with the intensity of total cultivation rather than just asymmetry in the timing. Whereas if you go to the Ganges, you see that you have a much higher deficit because of the changes in the timing as well. So that's why the hotspot basically shows up there in part. If we come to the United States, because most of us live here, so you want to know something about it, the graphics here are from the US Geological Survey from their assessment in 2006, and they show you the state by state where irrigation is prominent and the sources of irrigation, surface and groundwater. And if you jump to the picture on the right, what you see are total water withdrawals, and in green, the total irrigation estimated by these people. And what's interesting here is that the total irrigation as well as total water use in the United States has flattened out. Okay. Now, the thesis that I'm going to present to you is that this is not the case over most of the world, but in the United States, there are a couple of things that have happened that have caused this to go on, even though actually the total production of crops and total irrigated area has increased. So let's look at that. Here in the United States, people are concerned about the Ogallala Aquifer and also the South Florida Aquifer. The Ogallala is what you see in the Midwest. The South Florida one is obvious. And the graphic there highlights the percentage of total irrigation that comes from groundwater there. The one surprise in that figure is the lower Mississippi River Valley, because you would think that there's enough water there that groundwater usage would not be dominant, but it turns out that there's not that much diversion of that water in that area, so it's predominantly groundwater irrigated again. So that's kind of interesting. And then if you move to the top right, there you see the irrigated area going up, but the total irrigated water application actually decreasing in the recent period. So what's the story associated with that? There are two things. On the bottom right, what you see is 3 snapshots in time, which give you some indication of the different methods of irrigation application. So the thing that is at the bottom there, which is called gravity, is essentially flood irrigation. The ones above that are 2 different types of sprinklers, and then after that are the smaller quantities that are being supplied by things that are considered to be much more efficient, such as drip irrigation. So what you see happening in this trajectory is that the percentage of irrigated area associated with flooding the fields has gone down, and sprinklers have gone up, and drip has gone up a little bit. Okay? But that's basically, that's one contributor to the story. You have to keep in mind that drip is primarily associated with orchards and with vegetable gardening and not with grains. So the grain issue is different. So the second factor that has kicked in here is this, which is the shift in crops. And it's sort of subtle here the way these people show it, because many of the crops don't really change. What is shown here is a reduction in other lands and farms. And so it's hard to know what that means when somebody puts it that way, but that means basically pasture land that was irrigated. It means corn that was being grown not as a grain but for sugar production or so on. So those things have reduced, and corn for grain has gone up some, and other grains have reduced. The other grain that has dramatically reduced is rice primarily. So the shift in crops plus the methods of irrigation account for this. So one way of thinking about it is a message for the other places in the world, maybe, can you do these 2 things in some way and get somewhere? And I think Vijay and I, when we are talking later, one of the things we'll point out, hopefully, is that some of the things such as sprinklers and mechanization is much harder to do in developing countries where the farm sizes are way smaller, unless there's coordination between people. So some of that opportunity is not there, so we have to look at other ways to achieve the same sort of ends. The second issue associated with irrigation that I want to highlight is that of pollution. And it's an interesting one because if you look on the left side here, the graphics show pesticide leaching from farms and nitrogen leaching from farms as a surrogate for total fertilizer. And it turns out that this accounts for about half the total pollution in the main rivers in the United States. And if you look on the bottom right, you see with fertilizer that this has been a fairly steady increase but leveling off in the recent period. But the residence time associated with many of these products is quite a bit longer, and so these things stay. If I had the same picture associated for China, which shows up on the next graphic, what you see there is that's a steady climb that's still going on in terms of fertilizer application. And in China, it's roughly 50% of the fertilizer that is unaccounted for. Okay, so if you look at it that way, you start wondering why you would spend money on something that you're essentially throwing away, which shows up as pollution. And the net result of that in the graphic from China is on the top. Red means a river body is grade 5, which is as polluted as you can get. Yellow is slightly better, and blue is probably okay. So in most of the agricultural areas in China, things are not good. The graphic on the right shows you one person's estimates of how much groundwater is being used by country and how that has changed over time. So the red curve, which is the second highest one, is the United States. It's flat, consistent with what we saw earlier. The champion curve is India. It really takes off. And then China is the blue curve, which is number 3 at the very end as you go through. So the reason I'm highlighting this is that much of the mindset in the United States in terms of the agricultural people who are associated with irrigation was designing canal irrigation systems. And they propagated that in other places in the world. And today, the groundwater fraction of irrigation dominates. And so several of the things that were thought as golden truths, for example, at the basin scale, you have high efficiency because return flows will propagate, or something one should question as one goes through. So the summary observation I have at this point is that it's good that we have irrigation because it helps us improve yields, but the combination of excess fertilizer application and excess irrigation leads to excess leaching, which is a problem. And also it leads to groundwater depletion, which is a problem. So we have to think about how we deal with solving those problems. And the side issue there is how do you actually define efficiency? And I think intellectually that's become an issue because of the arguments that I'll show you coming right up. So these are due to a colleague I had when I was at Utah State University called Rick Allen and Lyman Willardson and others. These people are big names in the FAO sort of world, and they are actually very competent people who have done these things, and they lay out how one should think about different aspects of water application in agriculture and what can be considered beneficial use and what cannot, and you add all that up and see what you do with it in terms of defining an efficiency. But basically the efficiency is going to be total water used beneficially in some way, including by evapotranspiration by the plant, divided by the total water that you applied or diverted from a water body into it. So that's fairly simple and straightforward. And the typical canal irrigation bent comes through here because they argue, particularly in topography such as is present in Utah and Colorado, if the person who is high up in the topography waters their field to excess, that water will go into the ground, back into the canal and used by the next person. In fact, it's typical for somebody in Colorado to say that they use the water in the canal 6 times, okay, because of return flows. So that I think is good. So the argument that Rick Allen makes is that you should think about scale effects rather than getting hung up on on-farm water application efficiency, because there might be reasons to do that. But some of the things these people say, for example, look at the wording they have, benefit of low efficiency. Now, what they mean by low efficiency is not the system level efficiency, but the on-farm application efficiency, although they don't make that clear. And they say the benefits are this provides recharge to unconfined aquifers, It contributes to damping flood flows, which is sort of odd because if you maintain high soil moisture, you're not going to reduce flood flows, you're going to enhance them. But what they actually mean when you talk to them is that, oh, well, we can divert during a flood water into the fields, and you should count that. But that's not intentional irrigation, so I don't think that's fair. And then they talk about augmentation of stream flow during droughts because you have excess irrigation, and incidental groundwater recharge near oceans may help reduce saltwater intrusion and creation of fake wetlands. I don't quite see this set as particularly pleasing in terms of an engineering viewpoint of efficiency. So I put it up there, not with the intention of criticizing them, but because since these people are involved heavily with the FAO, this kind of mantra goes out to many people who may or may not think about what they transpire through. So then he's also got a list of appropriate reasons to consider on-farm efficiency, which are all good, and some reasons which he says are inappropriate, and I think those are pretty iffy. So the main thing that I want to drive out with this set is that I feel that it's important that one looks at both on-farm efficiency and system-level efficiency and find ways to improve them, and particularly with groundwater, the idea that you pump from depth, apply excess water, allow it to recharge at a relatively slow rate and pump it back up is at the very least very inefficient in terms of energy usage and not particularly a good idea. So the second thing that I want to bring up here as an example is something our group has done, and that is conscious spatial optimization of crops. And the argument here is that, okay, maybe you want to look at a system level, but let's take the system to an even larger scale beyond river basins and look at where you should grow specific crops which are best suited for a particular climate, not just the mean annual rainfall in a place, but also the variation so that you can reduce irrigation requirements. So this is done by our group, and the goal was maximize total farm income for India on the crops that the government procures, because the price is set on those, so you don't have to worry about price fluctuations. And can you do it with rain-fed agriculture alone? Can you do it with a minimum amount of irrigation alone? And meet all the production targets that they have? Is that possible? So when you run that model, and this particular run that I'm showing you is what happens with rain-fed, on the left is where rice is being grown today, on the right is where the model wants to grow rice. So you see a substantial shift there, and it actually doesn't just say shift rice from A to B, it tells you how much area it goes under rice there. Similarly with pulses, you see fairly dramatic shifts, and the net result of all this is that if you look at the picture on the left, that's the water deficit divided by mean annual rainfall, district by district in India under the current pattern, and anything that is pink or red is greater than 1. So you're basically using more water, substantially more water than the average annual rainfall, which is your upper limit on renewable supply. And on the right is the solution that comes up as far as water deficit is concerned after that. Okay, so you get a fairly substantial improvement there. And what's interesting is that you get a substantial increase in total agricultural revenue as well. Now the yields are lower under rain-fed conditions. Okay, so this is on average, and this doesn't address the fact that there are years that are major drought years and will be much worse than average. So, but on average, even rain-fed conditions deliver you higher income than what is realized with all the irrigation that goes on today, with free energy being supplied, which is something Vijay is going to hit. The irrigation water requirement in the rain-fed case obviously is not there, but if you allow a certain amount of irrigation nationally, it turns out that you can dramatically increase your revenue, and the revenue increase is coming partly from, or I would say dramatically from, the increase in oilseeds, okay, which is a high value item, and you're starting to grow it in many places which are not water stressed. And rice shifts to places which don't need to be water stressed with respect to rice. So that's the kind of solution that comes out. So to sum up, I think we are at a point in the world where to meet the growing populations, we absolutely need irrigation to help us, and we need fertilizers to help us, but we need to do this intelligently. Doing it intelligently means increasing on-farm water application efficiency. It means looking at system-level efficiency, and it means looking at a national or global scale and figuring out where it is best to grow different things. And the subtext of that is that if you actually pay attention to these things, you increase people's income. So I'll stop with that.
Okay. Thanks for having me here. So I'm going to talk about the hydrological effects of irrigation, particularly in the Bengal Basin, and thinking about sustainability of the use of groundwater for irrigation, mostly with respect to water quality, but at the end, if I have time, I might talk a little bit about some issues of water quantity as well. There are lots of different aspects of this work that have collaborators. So some of these are here. Carrie Radloff just finished her PhD here at Columbia, and I'm working with Lex Van Geen and Martin Stoot, Yan Zhang, Mahfouz Khan, and Kazi Mateen Ahmed and Pradeep Sikdar. So just a global thought about irrigation. We just saw a great talk on this already, but irrigation accounts for about 70% of our world water use, about 90% of the consumptive use. And groundwater irrigation accounts for about 43% of the total amount of irrigation, and this is increasing globally. So this is a chart of water usage, again, 70% agriculture, about 20% industry and energy, much of which is then returned to the system, and then 10% domestic use. And all of this groundwater use can lead to quantity issues, so groundwater depletion, issues of salinization, changes in soil chemistry and buildup of chemicals in the soil. We'll hear more about this with respect to arsenic in plants later. And then changes in hydrology and hydrogeology, which can lead to quality issues, and that's what I'll talk about now. So this, I think, is a similar map to what you just showed, a global map of irrigated areas, and you can see very intense irrigation in this area in southern Asia, and so I'm specifically going to talk about the Bengal Basin there. Google Earth image of this area. This is India around here, and Bangladesh. Here are the Himalayan mountains. This is the Bay of Bengal. And the problem here, I can't go into too much detail about it, but there are high levels of arsenic contamination, naturally occurring arsenic in groundwater in southern Asia, in many parts of southern Asia. And it is a big problem in the Bengal Basin. The colors here on this map, this is a map of Bangladesh. The colors are arsenic concentrations in wells measured throughout the region. The Bangladesh and India arsenic standard is 50 micrograms per liter. It's kind of a peach color. The World Health Organization arsenic health standard is 10 micrograms per liter. It's a light blue. So only these dark blue dots are safe according to the world standard for arsenic. So that means that within approximately this area, and this extends over into West Bengal and India, there is a high risk for high levels of arsenic. If we plot that same data with depth, this is arsenic concentration with well depth. This green line is the 50 microgram per liter regional standard. You can see that arsenic levels are highly variable, and there are some very high levels, but mostly the high levels are contained to the shallow groundwater. So below about 150 meter depth, there is widely low arsenic throughout the region. So one question is this distribution of arsenic sustainable if we start to use deep groundwater for drinking and for irrigation? So a cartoon conceptual model of how the system works looks something like this. There is a lot of irrigation, pumping groundwater, and then there are also smaller pumps, usually hand pumps for domestic use. The irrigation use in the region is about 10 times the domestic groundwater use. And so this creates some sort of vigorous flow paths in the shallow part of this system. Unfortunately, this is also where the arsenic is in the top 100 meters or so. There's a lot of water in the system. It's monsoonal, so every year much of the area floods. There are lots of rivers and and ponds on the surface, so there is a lot of available water. Deeper in the system, the sediments are a little bit different. They're older, and so often they can immobilize arsenic. They absorb arsenic. And there are also changes in lithology. So often if you dig a well, you'll see sand and clay alternating, which then affects how the groundwater flows. So the question is, if wells are put deeper into this system, will they just pull the high arsenic groundwater down from the shallow region, or will they somehow remain arsenic safe, so sustainable? And one way they could do that is hydraulically. So if the water flowing to these deep wells comes from somewhere outside of the area where there's high arsenic in shallow depths. And the second way is chemically. So even if the water is coming from the surface, maybe the sediments can immobilize the arsenic before it gets to the wells. To understand how this flow system works, we have to back up and think of the system on a larger scale. Think of it on the whole. And so on a larger scale, these low permeability clay units, it's harder for the water to flow through these units, these aren't continuous over the basin. But still, the groundwater may be flowing laterally in the deep parts of the system and coming from somewhere far away. So to understand how the groundwater flows, we can consider the entire basin. So this contour encompasses all of the permeable sediments of the Bengal Basin, and we made a model that encompasses all of those sediments with ModFlow. So this is a groundwater flow model. It's large scale, about 600 by 600 kilometers, going to about 3 kilometers deep. And so this is the 3D grid, and in each one of these little cells we can calculate hydraulic heads in the system and how the groundwater is flowing, and later I'll show you a solute transport model where we can calculate concentrations. Okay, so looking at some model simulation results, these are groundwater flow paths to deep parts of the Bengal Basin groundwater system before there's any pumping. On the left, I have just dots, so these are actually water particle endpoints. They're just evenly distributed at a depth of 200 meters in the system, and then we can track backwards how the water that reaches these points, we can track back where it came from. So these paths are from the recharge points to each of these locations at depth. And so what you see is that these flow paths are often very long. Some are 100 kilometers or more in the system, in the deep part of the system before there's any pumping. But if we include pumping, so the same system parameters, meaning the same geology in the system, we can assume, and we add pumping here on the left, both irrigation and domestic pumping, and we see that the system, the flow system looks completely different. You might not even see anything here, and there actually are flow paths, but they're very vertical, of flowing just from the surface down to depth. So, and another effect of this pumping, aside from just the flow paths, is that it increases the recharge to the system. So where there's enough water, it actually creates a lot more flow through the system, more than 3 times. So water use has pretty important impacts on hydrogeologic systems. Okay, so I wanted to ask this question about whether groundwater flow paths can protect deep groundwater. Can they create sustainability of this deep low arsenic resource? And so we can consider different pumping alternatives. The first you might think is the most conservative. Let's say we don't want to have any arsenic in our water, either for irrigation or for domestic use. We could put all of the pumps deep in the system. Another option is to leave the irrigation wells where they are currently, which is generally shallow, and then put domestic wells used for drinking water deeper in the system. And we can simulate this inside of this area where there's high arsenic. Okay, so this is 2 views of the system, one from above and one sort of from the side. These are flow paths within that high arsenic area. If all of the wells are put deep into the system at depths of greater than 200 meters. And what you can see is that the flow paths are pretty vertical. So water is flowing from the surface down to the deep wells. That means that if you're inside this high arsenic area, then the arsenic will eventually migrate down to the wells. You see a very different picture with the split scheme. So if only the domestic wells are put deep into the system, some of the flow paths are very long. So this water reaching the wells in this area is coming very deep in the system all the way from the edges of the system. So in some areas, there may be sustainable low arsenic groundwater. It's originating outside of this high arsenic area. And if we compare those two management schemes, we can see that the split pumping scheme, about 90% of the area is either sustainable, meaning the water is coming from outside of that area, or the travel times, the flow paths are very long, longer than 1,000 years. And we can compare that to only 14% in the deep pumping scheme. So clearly, the irrigation in the system is really important to the sustainability with respect to arsenic in this case. And one reason that is that irrigation wells can act as a hydraulic barrier. This is a plot of hydraulic head versus depth. We have the irrigation well zone above the domestic well zone in this split scheme. And I've plotted hydraulic head profiles at 3 locations, vertical profiles in the basin. The blue and green are in areas where water is sustainable. It's coming from outside the high arsenic area. And the red is an area where it's not sustainable. And so what you see is that in the areas that are sustainable, the hydraulic head in the irrigation well zone is lower than it is in the domestic well zone, which effectively creates an upward flow of water. So water is not going to flow, high arsenic water will not flow down to these deep domestic wells. The opposite is true in areas that are not sustainable. So you might ask, well, we really don't want to irrigate necessarily with high arsenic water, and we'll hear about some reasons that that's true. So maybe there should be some alternatives. What if we switch to surface water irrigation, for example? And so we simulated cases where there's half the amount of irrigation pumping, the red is no irrigation pumping, and this black profile is pre-development. And so what you can see is that we still get this profile. The green is the original amount of irrigation pumping. The blue has approximately the same profile with half irrigation pumping. And with no irrigation pumping at all, we get very close to the pre-development case, which, if you remember, has fairly long flow paths. So really, even without this irrigation hydraulic barrier, the model simulation tells us that still about 90% of that area would be sustainable on a 1,000-year time scale. Okay, so the second part is whether chemical properties of Bengal Basin sediments can improve sustainability. So I'm going to quickly talk about work of Carrie Radloff. She did some experiments with the deep sediments to see how much arsenic they could immobilize. And so she did some lab experiments where she took sediments and put them in the lab, and then she also did field experiments where she injected high arsenic groundwater into the aquifer system and then pulled it back out and measured how much arsenic there was. And so what she found is that if the aquifer sediments did not absorb or mobilize the arsenic, she would expect to see concentrations that go like this over time during her experiment. But what she saw were these concentrations. So the difference between these is the effect of adsorption. And so from these experiments, she could estimate absorption parameters, which we then put into our flow and solute transport model. So this is a model result calculating now concentration. So again, you see these flow paths that I had before, and the colors now are arsenic concentrations normalized at a depth of the top of the deep pumping horizon after 1,000 years, and I cut it off at 0.1. So what you see are arsenic contaminated areas greater than 10% of the maximum. And if there's no absorption in the system, about 56% of the area becomes contaminated. If there is absorption, a KD of 1 or a retardation factor of 14, which is probably a conservative estimate for Carrie's sediments, only 1% of the area is contaminated, and this is with that split scheme. If the irrigation wells are put deeper into the system, this is what we get. So if there's no sorption, 92% of the area is contaminated. And with sorption, it's still not a great outlook. 63% of the area is still contaminated. So some thoughts on irrigation and sustainability in the Bengal Basin. First, pumping, and especially irrigation, because it's the greatest groundwater use, really affects flow. Secondly, groundwater irrigation is an important factor in the sustainability for both arsenic migration and for groundwater depletion, which I didn't talk about. And lastly, management should target irrigation. So maybe there should be restrictions on depth and quantity of water pumped for irrigation, or potentially alternatives. And so if I have a couple of minutes, I thought I would talk a little bit about a potential scheme to a management scheme that might reduce depletion, so might deal with a water quantity issue rather than a water quality issue. And so this is an idea that was brought up about 35 years ago, actually, by Roger Revelle in a science paper in 1975. And the World Bank is interested in this, and they asked us to think a little bit about it, and so we have been. And so the question is, can large-scale irrigation pumping be managed for hydrologic benefits? So this scheme is kind of involved, and it looks something like this. So if we have, I missed that. Here we're thinking actually mostly about the upper Ganges Basin, where depletion is more of an issue. Before we were looking at the lower Ganges Basin. And one big problem in this system is that the downstream areas see effects of upstream diversions for irrigation. And one of those effects is that during the dry season, the flows are lower, and so there are salinization issues and water quantity issues. And during the monsoon season, all the dams are open, and there is a lot of water that creates flooding, right? So this idea is that, so there are a lot of canals in the upper part of the Ganges Basin. They're already existing. The idea is that canals in the dry season can divert the river flow to go to irrigation fields and also to go to other downstream reaches of the river, and this can be blocked off by a dam. And then pumps can be installed near the river, alongside the river, and that water can then be carried to fields for irrigation, and it can also be diverted downstream. So the water that's pumped during the dry season is used to augment the dry season flow, so increase the flow in the river in the dry season. And if we look at this in cross-section, we have pumping and recharge during the monsoon. So if we pump during the dry season, the hydraulic head might look something like this, so it's very low near the river, and then it recharges during the monsoon. And so this area in here is water that's stored during the monsoon, so that can actually act to reduce the monsoon flooding. And so we've thought about this a little bit and done some very simple simulations thinking about different conditions in the volume stored. And so these are these simulated hydraulic head profiles for 2 different pumping rates, but we can consider lots of factors. And this is the volume stored per year per 3,200 kilometer reach of river. And so that science paper estimated about 70 billion meters cubed per year, and in these 2 simulations we get a little bit less than that, but it's pretty widely varying. So I don't know if this is the answer. I mean, maybe it's a pretty involved scheme, but I think it might be worth thinking about whether there are creative or alternative ways to manage irrigation for sustainability. So thanks again to collaborators and funders. That's it.
Thank you. I'm going to talk specifically about water and rice, and you see some of our collaborators and our donors for this work. Rice, of course, uses a lot of water compared to other crops, but actually not more in terms of transpiration. In other words, the actual plant requirement of rice is no different than the plant requirement for wheat or maize or other crops, basically. And you see the transpiration requirement there of about 400 millimeters. The real excess water use in rice is actually in maintaining this flooded soil condition that we have in rice paddies. and that leads to a little bit more cost of water use in land preparation, in evaporative losses from the surface of the paddy, but particularly potentially large losses of water by percolation through the soil profile. And you see that this is a highly variable amount depending on the soil texture. If you have a heavy clay, maybe a millimeter a day, but if you have a sandy soil, you can be losing many centimeters per day. So it varies a lot. Probably on average, rice uses 2 to 3 times as much water than other crops. This is a projection of water scarcity in 2025 by the International Water Management Institute in Sri Lanka. And the orange-colored areas are those where you will have physical water scarcity. And this is measured really in availability of surface water and not groundwater. So this is actually a deficiency of this study. But you can see that many of these places where we've talked about there being a lot of irrigation, also being a lot of water scarcity. The purple color is where you will have economic scarcity of water. And these authors define that mostly in terms of lack of infrastructure to use the water that is available. And this is even true then in sub-Saharan Africa. In Bangladesh, economic scarcity to us doesn't mean lack of availability or infrastructure. It means the actual cost to the farmer of pumping. Although it is true that in parts of the country, shallow tube wells are going dry in the dry winter season as the rivers drop, as Holly mentioned. In Bangladesh, the use of groundwater to produce rice is very important. There are roughly 1 million shallow tube wells across the country accessing, in some cases, high arsenic water to irrigate rice. And you can see here the growth of this winter or Boro season rice over time, and it now is actually slightly more important in terms of overall rice production in the country than the main monsoon rice season is. And Bangladesh went from being almost the worst case in terms of food insecurity to now being self-sufficient pretty much in rice. So this has made a big impact on food security in the country. This is another version of that groundwater arsenic map, and you can see that a lot of the country is at levels that we would not like to certainly drink. We prepared also a map of soil arsenic on a very coarse scale, only about 400 data points here. But what you can clearly see in the darker gray, the higher the values, and going to values that are more than 20 parts per million in the soil, whereas the global sort of national, the global soil uncontaminated background level would be around 5 parts per million. So these values are getting up pretty high. You can see that the soil, which is really the surface sediment material, is elevated in arsenic in the Ganges floodplain, and not in the other parts of the country so much. So this is then of particular interest. So we have both water contamination with arsenic and parts of the country where we have soil contamination with arsenic too. And this soil contamination is partly geological, I'm sure, high background levels, and partly it's exacerbated by the use of high arsenic irrigation water. So this has two complications for rice production. One is arsenic is toxic to plants, including rice, and the high bioavailability of arsenic in this flooded soil environment leads to high uptake by rice, meaning that the grain quality is poor and potentially also contributes to adverse human health effects. So we actually looked at potential solutions to that. Well, okay, sorry, I got ahead of myself here. What I want to show you first then that is rice, arsenic is toxic to rice. And we did this study in a particular tube well command area in Faridpur district where there was an arsenic gradient created across this command area by the use of irrigation water that had about 100 parts per billion arsenic in it over a 20-year time period. And you can see this gradient goes from less than 15 to actually about 60 parts per million in the soil. So we grew the main winter season rice variety, Biridan 29, across this soil arsenic gradient in 2 successive years, and this is what happened to yield. So a lot of arsenic toxicity. This variety is relatively vulnerable to arsenic toxicity and a pretty linear decrease over that range in soil arsenic concentration. So what can we do about this? Is there some way that we can manage this through water management or reduce the toxicity? And yes, there is. The idea here would be to grow rice under a less reduced condition with less water use, and this would make the arsenic less soluble in the soil solution, and then hopefully we would reduce the toxicity issue. So we chose to do this through a particular system. There's different ways of doing this. We used a raised bed and furrow irrigation system. We specifically wanted to get away from the flood irrigation of a flat field, which has all sorts of other negative effects that I don't have time to go into. This bed can be made by locally produced machinery behind a two-wheel Chinese tractor that basically starts out as a big rototiller, but you can put various other kinds of attachments on it. In the right panel there, you can see very healthy-looking rice growing on a raised bed with some water in the furrows. In our experiment, then, this was fairly early in the growth. On the right-hand side, you can see the conventional flooded paddy and the raised beds on the left. You notice wide spacing between rows and actually quite a reduction in the plant population there compared to the conventional paddy on the right. Early on, earlier than this photograph, the rice on the beds looked worse than the conventional. Here it looks pretty similar. A bit later on, you can see that the rice on the raised bed is looking much healthier than that on the right. And at harvest, again, you can see on the right, the crop is more mature. It's not got as many panicles and as much rice as the beds on the left there. And this was the impact on the crop productivity. So using this raised bed with less water, 30 to 40% less irrigation water was used. You can see that we minimize, we don't entirely eliminate the toxicity to rice, but we reduce it. So if you've got soil arsenic roughly less than 40 parts per million, you would be okay. We've looked at different rice, how different rice varieties respond to arsenic toxicity. This is just a slide showing results from a few varieties. You can see that different varieties behave differently in the conventional paddy. That BR45 in this one is the one that is most vulnerable, and BR47 in those great blue triangles is the most tolerant across that whole range of soil arsenic concentration. And then BR36 is not affected until about 40 microgram or 40 parts per million, and then it plummets as you go to about 60. On the right-hand side, those two graphs just show the performance of rice on the raised bed compared to the conventional system, and you can see that in these cases it performed quite well. The other issue is the arsenic content in the rice itself, both the straw and the grain, because the straw is used for animal feed, and of course the grain is used for human food. So basically here on the left you can see that arsenic in the straw was reduced a lot by the raised bed compared to the conventional rice paddy. On the right-hand side, you can see that the arsenic in the rice grain was also reduced in those first two arsenic levels, but not at the higher two arsenic levels. So at this level, probably there's some physiological interference in terms of translocation within the plant. We have grown rice with much less water, and this is a complicated set of experiments, so I don't really want to explain them, but basically the numbers in parentheses represent the number of days that the rice is grown without flooded, without this was a greenhouse experiment, but without the container being flooded. And then the bottom two are a saturated condition and a moist condition where the water table is maintained at a depth of 10 centimeters with the saturated condition and 20 centimeters with the moist condition. I just want to point out the result with the moist condition. And you can see that, in that case, the straw arsenic concentration was 0.06 parts per million versus about 7 or so with the conventional system. And the grain arsenic was 0.012. So if you grow rice really in an environment with much less water, you can almost eliminate arsenic from the plant. So it becomes like wheat or maize. However, the problem with this is that the yield of rice is dramatically reduced by this treatment, as you can see in those those two bars on the far right. So basically, if we're going to adopt this strategy, we need to have rice varieties that are more tolerant of aerobic conditions. Although these aerobic conditions I'm talking about are still pretty wet. Having a water table at 20 centimeters is still pretty wet for growing crops in general. But this is an avenue that I think we probably can succeed with. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
My background is mechanical engineering, so I'm not a water person. So I want to somehow try to convert this into an energy talk. Okay, so you know, and hopefully I can make a connection, and working closely with the Water Center, with Professor Lal, Kapil Narula, who's based in India, Ram Fishman, who was a graduate student here, now a fellow, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, and many others in the field team. And I wanted to discuss a little bit of the India water situation, its connection to energy and the political economy of how the groundwater situation in India came about to be what it is today. And since electricity had a lot to do with it, trying to see if electricity can get us out of it as well. Okay. Now, I think the speakers earlier have already pointed out how groundwater plays a pretty important role, an increasingly important role in irrigation compared to surface water. And the same is true of India, perhaps more so than any other place. And today, maybe about few years ago, 5 years ago, was a kind of important point where more irrigation in India occurred from groundwater than surface water. And of course, today it is even higher. So over the 50-year history of independent India, 60-year history, we have gone from a point where groundwater was maybe less than 5% to something like 55–60% today. Surface water irrigation, which was the dominant method, is now not the dominant method. In fact, it's less than 50%. So, just a big picture of India. In 50 years, food production went up by 4.2, times. So that's fourfold increase in food production. Population went up by about 3. So clearly there was more food per capita. And this had a lot to do with the Green Revolution. Right? And rice went up 4, wheat went up 10 times. But very interesting to keep in mind that pulses, which were kind of a protein source, and coarse cereals, which are very adapted to rain-fed situations, such as millet, sorghum, actually went up less than 2 times. So the per person, that source, and this has its own consequences. You know, we have traded calories for protein. How does this project into the future? I don't know. Will it be a very starch plus some other protein source, the direction China is going, or not? That has its own consequences. Okay, because pulses from a protein per water perspective are pretty good. Okay, but that just gives you a sense that we have, to meet calorific needs, we have gone this direction. Okay, how was it achieved? You know, land area, actually increasing amount of land was very little to play a role. Most of it was through increasing yields or production per unit land. Some of it was double cropping, but we'll see most of it was through irrigation. And of course, you know, the we cannot, I'm not proposing that all that yield came from irrigation alone. It was a combination of fertilizer, seed, and irrigation. Now, if you look at a big picture, this is from about 6 years ago, but the picture hasn't changed that much. Total food production in India, 210 million tons. It's probably about 230, 240 now. Irrigated land produces 60% of the food from 40% of the land. Right? Rain-fed produces 40% of the food from 60% of the land. So the irrigated yields are about 2.25 times rain-fed yields. Now, one could argue what's the additional food from irrigation? Is that's about, you know, if you just compare the difference, it would be about 70 million tons. But if you say, oh, you know, you would never have had this irrigated yields at all in the dry season without water, then you would say, and if all of it came from irrigation, you'd say, oh, that's about 100 million tons is from irrigation, right? Now, I want to give a historical perspective. So this irrigation now is dominantly from groundwater. Now, I want to come to this in a second, but what I want to point out is that the dominant form of groundwater irrigation today is through electric pumps, and the electricity is supplied by a government parastatal or a utility. There is significant amount of diesel pumps as well, but the dominant contribution to this food production comes from electricity pumps. So want to give you a little bit of a history of this because I think it is important. Post-independence, India got independence in 1947, in 50s, early 60s, actually electricity coverage was not that high, but where the electricity coverage was there was meters, people would pay for electricity, but the meter collectors were by and large, the meter readers were by and large subcontracted staff. Now in one state, in Uttar Pradesh, the meters readers wanted to become part of the utility to get benefits, the same, health and whatever vacation benefits as, because they were just subcontracted out, so they went on a strike. They went on such a long strike that, no meters were read for a very long time. Finally, the state caved in and made them part of the regular staff. At which point they stopped reading meters altogether. So then, the state said, wait a minute, we are in this weird situation, how can we collect tariff? So they said, okay, we won't read meters because that's, we don't have staff anymore that is willing to do that. Can we just look at the horsepower of the pump and charge you by the horsepower of the pump? So that was the beginning of flat tariff. Okay, so then you don't have to read meters every month. But then, this became, okay, so now that was the first entry point for farmers. Okay, we can use more, but we wanted to pay for more as long as our pump horsepower is the same. So this was the beginning of the flat tariff regime, which is I just pay a fixed price, I can use as much as I want, and maybe I can buy a 5 horsepower motor, but it really is 7 horsepower, but the nameplate is 5, and those kind of games started. Gradually, this became so organized that the farmers actually became a lobby and convinced the government to not charge for electricity at all. So then once it happened in one state, this started to spread. There's other states also the farmers organized and said, Now, at the time, farmers are large in number, they are very strong politically. Yeah, in India, of course, they are a very large number compared to here, but in other countries also, small number of farmers carry a lot of clout. So I'm not, saying good or bad about this, but this is the history of it. Okay. Now, so that led to the utility actually was in this situation where the government asked the utility to supply power but cannot collect revenue. So gradually the utility started to ignore agriculture customers. It would not replace a transformer that would get burnt out. It would not, not give new connections. Gradually it started to stop supplying 24 hours at all. They would say, look, we only have so much electricity and we can't supply 24. So in order to reduce or match demand to supply, since there was no metering or no billing, they started to reduce the number of hours of supply. So the number of hours of supply gradually became 8 to 10. But even those 8 to 10 hours of supply per day became of erratic voltage. It would not be, the full voltage. It would not be 3-phase. So then farmers started to invest in capacitor banks so that they can use single phase to run a 3-phase motor. So there's a whole industry of electrical engineering and all this started in the rural sector. This is kind of chicken, mouse and cat game of the government. So anyway, but this really contributed to increase in food production. Okay, in spite of all these headaches, I don't want to, eventually 2001 there are 10 million electric pumps. Okay, today could be 15 million. Then one government, and which is actually the place where we are working, tried what was considered a very progressive experiment. And here's the experiment that they did. Okay, so where is Gujarat, first of all? That's why I was looking for a map to stick it in there. Okay, so this Gujarat is, let me see if I can use this. Yeah, so Gujarat, this is the state of Gujarat right here. Okay, now this is an antiquated depth map of Gujarat. This is, of course, a data challenge in India. Even though we measure depths every 5 years, we have a whole census. We have very poor, actually, transparency and mapping of the data. It shows here, in this map, we are sort of right here. It shows maybe 10 meters. We are working with 200 meter depth water there, okay, in the actual monitoring wells. Okay, so that's where we are. But this state tried a very, and that's where the state is right here, and this is where we are working in this area, North Gujarat. They tried a very, what was considered a progressive experiment. They said, look, we have committed to the farmers to give free electricity. We are having to provide shoddy electricity as a result of the fact that it is free. But since infrastructure is common, all the other part of the rural economy, such as agro-processing, there is education, there is health, there is household, they are also getting shoddy electricity. So what do we do? So they said, we will take every substation and run 2 wires from the substation. So this is how it looks. I'm going to skip this. So we're going to, instead of wires running to each village, right, and this is a conventional architecture. You have the same infrastructure that supplies an agriculture customer or a domestic customer or a commercial customer, because it's expensive to deploy infrastructure. They said we will run now a parallel infrastructure to each village. One wire will provide electricity for farmers, which will come on only 8 hours a day, and there will be another parallel wire, which will be a 24-hour wire, which will be paid wire. See, because if you mix the paid and free wire, then you don't know how much went in. So imagine an entirely parallel infrastructure was created. Now, the shock is that this heavy investment, which cost about $500 per pump, was recovered within 2 years because of the net extra revenue that it generated, because now all these people could pay and use the electricity. Okay. But it was still a massive investment. Okay. Now, I'll come to this later, but this model has been now considered very successful, even though it seems absurd that one would do this if India had to do this with 10 million pumps, $500 per pump. You are talking about $5 billion just to run this parallel wire, all because you want to provide free electricity to this wire. Now, a simple device such as an electricity meter could actually meet that demand on a common wire. So you could have a common wire and electricity meters on all of this and convince the agriculture customer that certain amount of electricity that is metered is essentially free. Some biophysical amount or something. Or you could come up with some other scheme. My point is that years of lack of trust between government and the farmers created a situation where any attempt at metering that power was fraught with suspicion. And that led to free electricity, which meant that the marginal cost of water was zero, which meant I don't even have to put a valve on my tap or the pipe. Millions of these pumps don't even have a shut-off valve. When the electricity comes on, the water comes out, whether the plant needs it or not, or whether there is even plant on the field or not. Okay, so big picture of this is 100 billion kilogram of food through irrigation. About my estimate is that 50% is from electric, because about 70%, 60-70% is from groundwater, and dominant of that is electric as opposed to diesel. And if you look at what is the reported amount of electricity going to agriculture, that is 2 kilowatt hour per kilogram of food today. Okay. It varies from 1 to 3 from parts of India to other parts of India. In North Gujarat, where the groundwater table is deeper, is 3. Could be 3.5. But that gives you a sense of just for irrigation pumping how much energy is going. Okay. Sorry for the numbers being in rupees, but let me just put very simply that this 3 units of electricity in the US, would cost 45-50 cents. In the India, it's 30 cents. And the cost of the price of 1 kilogram of wheat, if I looked it up today, $280 a ton, 30 cents. In other words, if you actually had to, this is a complex economic situation, if you actually had to charge for this, the food price would have to double, or the farmer, or the alternative would be, you tell the farmer, look, you have to pay for it, they might stop farming, reality might be somewhere in between, but just so that you get a sense today, the rough price of food that it fetched is the same as the amount that the government gave to the farmer in free electricity. One could imagine if you gave that, as an amount to the farmer, that look, why don't you just have the money and not the electricity? What the farmer would do is a good question, right? So, okay, so that's the same thing I wanted to point out. So that's the problem part of it, and I'm not going to go. We have experts here on this issue in this part of Gujarat. Over the years and years, people have punched through, clay sort of layers to get to deeper and deeper water tables. This is where we are working, and so what are we trying as a potential way out of this, right? So the question is, if farmers are provided an entitlement, right, metered entitlement, this is what you were getting every year for the last few years, but if you consume less than that entitlement, we will provide you an incentive or a compensation. Right? That would be one way, because that way the political economy aspects are preserved. The farmers, otherwise, if the moment we talk about pricing or metering, anybody in the government will say, are you crazy? Get out of here. This will never work, because we will be thrown out of election. In the next election, we will be out of power. So you have to, so the question is, just like the early stages kind of snowballed into something, can we now create a new example, a new paradigm, and maybe that can snowball to change this situation? That's the question. So the question is, if we tell the farmer that you will have this entitlement, but if you use less than that entitlement, then the thing is that electricity is worth so much that the utility can turn around and sell that electricity to other customers. And so for the utility, it's a win-win situation. For the farmer, they still have the entitlement that they had. So now, but of course, this raises questions of how do you distribute, define this entitlement? Will farmers agree to be metered? Will the utility be able to administer? So I want to say that, first of all, this first one is the thorny question that we are trying to address. I can tell you that this is something we have now been convinced that the farmers have, when properly explained the scheme, totally willing to meter. So this kind of paranoia that the farmer will not allow metering, which is what we constantly faced, at least I can say that what we have learned in the last few months, we have managed to convince the utility to actually offer this scheme at their own expense. They have little bit watered down, and I'll show you how they watered it down, but just to give you a sense of the political realities, right? So here's how they watered it down. We recommended that, look, why don't you compensate at the same price as you would sell that electricity to somebody else? But they made it half of that, so that now if the farmer saves, they get to keep half, etc., right? So, whereas they could have made it a strong lever, right? We said, what if a farmer can save 30%, 40%, maybe, uses some fancy technique to reduce water dramatically. But they were worried about giving too much compensation, so they capped it at 15%. I feel like everything we asked, they made it half, so we should have maybe asked for double first or something, We said, can we do this for 5 years? Can you guarantee for 5 years so that the farmer can make capital improvements? If you just do 1 year, they made it 3 years. So anyway, I'm also learning about the Indian government, even though I'm from India. So I think that, but the spirit of it is there, so there are now some sort of thorny, what I call smaller byproduct issues also arising. So here's a byproduct issue, okay? If the marginal cost of water is 0 and you have created a big pump, tell me, by the way, how I'm on time. I'm done. Okay, so the marginal cost of water is 0, right? Now, therefore, if I have excess capacity, I'm willing to sell that water to my neighbor who might be quite poor, who might actually be a distant relative, and I'm willing to supply that water at very low price to somebody who could not afford to drill a deep well. So here's something interesting, right? It was fundamentally a bad idea, but now it has some good consequence. And the good consequence is that you can use that extra capacity to sell this water at a cheap price to a water buyer. Now if we try to put a marginal price on water, I might forget about that relative. Right? What happens to that? So sometimes an entrenched system creates this. So it is, by the way, turning out that, at least in the area we are working, the long historical relationship the farmers have with each other in the community, they are not willing to turn off that power, that supply of water, even after marginal pricing. So that's, you know, so there's some sociological maybe lessons here as well. Now, and you know, different time of the year, the consumption is different. So here's how we proposed, how do you create this entitlement? Okay, we had long internal debates and working with the government. Either you can create an entitlement based on land owned, but not everybody might be irrigating the same amount of land. So how do you create that? You can create an entitlement based on, you know, depth of water in the area, what crop you grow. It can get very complicated. But the government advised us that the entitlement that is likely to work is something that preserves the status quo. In other words, those who have a certain degree of pump, don't take away anything from them. Otherwise they'll, right? So it's interesting political economy that the entitlement is therefore based on the past 3 years of use in the area and based on your pump size. So if on average each pump was run for 2,000 hours in that very specific location, then the entitlement is in the form of that many hours of use for that pump and its horsepower. Now if you then, so we had to go measure those horsepowers carefully. Again, there are issues with that. Then you know, if you change that horsepower, that has its own issues. So this is not simple, but it does allow a potential way out. Now, what is very interesting is, and I'm going to skip this, I want to just go to where the debate is today. So what is very interesting is in this last year or two when we started this project, suddenly this issue has gained a lot of momentum. Okay, people are by the way trying to reform energy subsidy. Everything people have been trying to do in India for 20 years, right? Anything. They've been trying to reform this stuff for a long time. Suddenly, this thing has picked up a lot of momentum. So now everybody is looking at the Gujarat idea of should we separate these feeders first. And, you know, this is, you know, billions of dollars of investment. So they are looking at that. And our debate and question is that from what we have learned so far, and we have been really actually doing this experiment only for a few months, it took us 3 years to convince the government, I won't go there, but that, you know, question is from what little have we learned and the government's excitement to do something about this at this particular point in time. How can we shape the policy for the rest of India based on what we have learned? Otherwise, we may go down a path based on something that we knew 5 years ago and scale it up. So I will just leave it at that and maybe come in questions. So that's my talk.
Okay, so I feel like I'm being overexposed here relative to the come back again. So this talk was designed to actually follow Vijay closely, and the question Vijay raised is, okay, so these people are using a certain amount of energy and water. Suppose we give them a way by which there is some incentive for them to use less. How do they get there? You know, do they grow less? If you do that, then you're back to the conundrum that Vijay raised. If you give them a way to do on-farm efficiency, then maybe you can get there. But the question is that there are many ways to get to that. Why is it that these people are not using them? And you know, is there some way we can get there? So what I'm going to do is basically cover 3 things. A quick background on Punjab, which is another state in India that grows most of the food for the country, basically, in terms of what the government procures. I'll talk a little bit about some insights we got from our field experiment, and then finally I'll point to the direction that Vijay and I think we are going with this. So starting out with Punjab, this is a state which has about 1.5% of the total land area of the country and contributes 57% of the total grain that is produced. Okay, so that's remarkable. The question is, how do you do that? And you do that with a cropping intensity which is about 189%. You irrigate your entire area, And it started out as a surface water irrigation scheme, and now it's primarily groundwater. One interesting thing I've learned there, which is just a quick anecdote to throw out, fitting with the things Vijay has been talking about, is that there is a major dam there that was built to provide surface irrigation and electricity. When it was built, it contributed about a third of the electricity in North India, all of North India. Today, I learned that 91% of the water diverted from the canals never reaches the intended users. So it's very hard to talk about water scarcity when you have that sort of a situation. So if the people don't get it, they use groundwater. So that's the story. And most of this area now grows rice and wheat. Traditionally, it grew pulses, which is what our optimization model also says it should do. But the productivity totally is the highest in India. So it's 9.5 tons of rice and wheat put together over the cycle that they go through, and then they have an intermediate crop of pulses. This is basically what has happened with the overall production in Punjab in terms of crop choice. And starting in the 70s, when the government started procuring rice from there, they have basically become a rice state. Prior to that, this was not a story at all. Turns out, as both two speakers pointed out earlier, rice is the major water consumer out of this. In addition to being a major water consumer, if you overwater it, you have a serious problem. Okay, so that's essentially the background story. Here, basically, it's showing the groundwater drop, which is continuing at a rate of about 1 meter per year. From the map that Vijay was showing of depth to groundwater, that was 10 to 20 meters. Today, you're looking at 30 to 60 meters below surface. So that's that story. I think I'm going to skip over this and move to this part. So this is the productivity increases in rice and wheat. So with irrigation and fertilizers and better seeds, they've gone from 2.5 tons to about 4.5 tons in both. And that comes with a quadrupling of, or 5 times increase in the electricity that's being used. Okay? So that's the part that Vijay was basically emphasizing as well. So, and doubling of fertilizer. We'll skip that along. So our diagnosis of the problem in this particular state with regard to why the water situation is going to get bleaker and bleaker, and if this state contributes 57% of the total food of the country, the cost of producing that food is going to go up dramatically, or they're not going to produce it. So that's the bottom line story. So why does this come? It comes because the government chooses to procure rice and wheat from a place which should not be growing rice. And it comes because they give free electricity, the part that Vijay talked about. So the water use turns out to be 150% of the total rainfall in the place, which is pretty remarkable to achieve. And much of the total energy used in this state goes not for industry, commerce, health, etc., but for pumping groundwater. Okay? In Gujarat, Vijay didn't point it out, it's a similar number or larger in that area. So that's the outcomes from this are that the energy subsidy, the money that the government is spending on energy, exceeds the education budget or the health budget, and you have taken a situation which was highly industrializing in the past, and the industry is gone. Okay, so for the farmers, it's interesting. The paradigm that most people told us was similar to what Vijay described, that the farmers will never be willing to be metered. It turns out farmers in our surveys indicate a willingness to be metered. So you ask the question, why? And the answer to that is that they experience regular costs of deepening wells and higher horsepower motors. So their reaction is, this is not sustainable, and we actually do want to pay, but we want reliable electricity. To deliver reliable electricity, the state wants to do the feeder separation that Vijay talked about. So that's regurgitating some of that. Also, what has started happening here is that because of high use of nitrogen, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizers, and pesticides, and high rate of groundwater application, the shallow groundwater is now highly polluted. So you have maternal mortality rates, maternal cancer rates, infant mortality rates, which are 3 times the national average in a state which has the highest per capita income or the second highest per capita income in the country. So not a good story. So what we tried to do was we tried a 3-part strategy here. The first is the story that Vijay talked about, except in the state of Punjab, the politicians weren't willing to go at all, so we gave up on that. The second is a strategy similar to what John talked about, which is do aerobic rice, which was being promised by people as a strategy which would be useful. And the last is we tried to see if we could actually train these people to use a device which measures the soil moisture stress and then apply water correspondingly instead of just willy-nilly watering. So the goal from all this was to see if we could reduce the water application, which goes one-to-one on energy reduction, and then see what the benefits are out of that. So that's basically the idea here. So I'll skip some of these things and focus on the red one. And basically the question that is asked is ways of measuring soil moisture or ways of reducing water usage in rice are manifold. They exist. The best state university extension program in India is in this state. So why is it that this is not going through? And the question that then maps into, can you come up with an experiment where you allow these people to do various things, see which one they really like, and then see if you can scale that up. Okay, so that's the way we approach this. So that's basically that story. So the device that I'm talking about is called a tensiometer. In the US, it's sold for between $60 to $250. So if you are a farmer making a certain amount of money in India, Punjab is high, but we could look at other places too. This is not something that you're willing to use. Okay? The device on the left is the so-called high-end device. Actually, there are much higher-end devices with electronics in them, but that's the one that's going for a fair amount of money in India. What the people at the Punjab Agricultural University did is remove the pressure gauge on this device and just put colored paper, which is red, yellow, green, tuned for rice. So if it goes to yellow, you need to water. If it goes to red, you've waited too long. And the way this device works is that basically it's got a plaster cast at the bottom, which is porous and allows water to come in. So it sits in the soil. If that water, so it sits in the soil, and what you do is you fill the tube with water, and then you seal it at the top. So then as the soil depletes in water, the water from the tube starts going out, and when it gets to a certain suction pressure, you have that when you water. That's it. Okay? So very simple. This comes down to roughly $7 to $8 instead of $60 from doing this. So we put this out, and there's a picture in the field, there's all these farmers, so you can get a flavor of what these people look like. And the basic results that we got out of this was, in the first year, we had 525 farmers who tried this, who tried the direct seeding of rice, and we had people who had done laser leveling of their fields and some people who had not. So we inherited that as a mix in the overall experiment. So the bottom line turned out to be the following. It took us 6 weeks through the Punjab Agricultural University to recruit these 500 farmers. They were pretty skeptical about the whole experiment. They had to be cajoled. There were women, students, and faculty who were involved. They tell me that they cried to get these people to do what was required, and they then did it. So that's useful, I guess, to remember as a strategy. So anyway, what turned out was that these farmers did a paired test. So they have an acre under tensiometer or laser leveling or direct seeding of rice, and then they have the rest of their land. They do whatever they want there. The farmers there were 85% of the farmers stuck with it, saved about 30% water in the process, and were very enthused about being salespeople for this idea. The other 15% had a variety of reasons why they didn't follow it, so they didn't save anything. But if you average all those across, it turns out that you save about 22% of water. If you were in a research setting, rather than random farmers doing whatever they want with no controls and no inducements to actually follow the program, you would probably save 35–40% water in the process. Okay? But this is essentially a field test with human behavior thrown in. So that was kind of interesting. And we started thinking about, okay, this translates into a very quick payoff. This looks good. Farmers want to do it. How do you scale it up? So that's the experiment going on this year. And the big insight we had was, okay, maybe we can go to farmer cooperatives. These cooperatives exist to buy fertilizer in bulk and then divide it up, and go to them and see if they are willing to take this on. So we took some of the farmers who had used it the previous year, they went to them, and in 10 days we had 5,500 farmers recruited. So that's pretty interesting in terms of the dynamic for how this works. So what happens this year? We have a disaster. The disaster is the following. That device was made by this person who's a professor at the university with some people working with him, and he's sitting there gluing things together to make this device. To make 5,500 of them was a challenge for him. So he delivered 3,800 when the season started. And that was under quite a bit of abuse from the rest of us. 2,000 of those things failed right away. They leaked or other disasters happened. So we've been now trying to think about, okay, what is a robust way of coming up with a device that could actually do this and more, okay? So we scoured the marketplace and started looking at what are the technology choices. And some of the issues that come up are, we want something that does not require training to use, okay? We want it to be low cost, under 10 bucks. We want to know what density it should be installed at. We want to know that it's robust enough not to have issues with leakage and so on. And moreover, what these people were doing with it was, they were deciding when to irrigate. Okay, if the thing went down, we want to also stop irrigation. And the logic for that is that if you're applying fertilizer, it leaches through with overwatering. So when you have applied enough, you want to stop. So you want stop, start, and to be more precise about it, we also want to monitor the nitrogen in the soil continuously. So we want all this, and we want it for under 10 bucks. Can it be done? Okay, so that's sort of the goal. So this is some attributes of soil, and you can do gravimetric, volumetric, or suction pressure measurements of what's going on. And field capacity is the number that you want to target for most crops. So that basically says that there is enough water in there that the soil, that the plant can suck it without really much effort. And that's basically the idea. If it goes to wilting point, that's bad. So if you look at suction, 10 to 33 is the number that you're shooting for in kilopascals. Here's a variety of devices that are out there in the market. And you can see that the tensiometer thing that we used basically works well through about 80 kilopascals, but you need to be around 15 to 35, it turns out. So that's not bad. The things that are at the top do very well across a very broad spectrum of range. Now what happens is that these things cost between $20 to $30,000. Okay, so that's not so good, and we still don't have any sense of how we would come up with a way to stop watering or nitrogen on it. So we fooled around, and we also looked at the spatial attributes. These are sensors at 3 different depths at 3 locations, and what you see is that their behavior is quite different, and these are located quite close to each other. So the spatial variability is important, and you have to pay attention to it. So even if you're in the US and you want to buy a $30,000 sensor, you may want to think about what to do, because each of these sensors only measures soil moisture in 2 to 10 centimeters of soil around it. So that's not so hot. So we've looked at a whole bunch of these things, and we are headed towards something like this, which is made in China, and in many people's view it is junk, because it's made in China. By definition it must not be very good, but this is an electrical resistivity device. There are also similar capacitance-based devices. This particular device came from China, shipped for $6. Okay? It measures pH, it measures soil moisture, and it measures light. Okay, so it's not quite the right combination of things we were looking for, but close enough, right? So, and if you buy 10,000 of them, it's $3. Now, Vijay, being a sensors expert, is looking at airbags, capacitance sensors on airbag, and those apparently cost $2. So we are thinking we can get there. And the general idea is that if we do an integration across some of these, maybe you can just spray them all over the landscape, and you can get a very precise measurement of what you're trying to do. And the kind of things that we would like to be able to achieve are done. Once I started blanketing, everybody I know who does soil moisture sensors will request, saying, this is our specs, can you do it? And we sell 1 million of them for you per year. What I learned was that most of these people sell 5 to 10,000 soil moisture sensors a year, largely to research clients, and they charge the large amounts of money for them, and they are not interested. They actually do not have any business sense. The guy from Decagon, the guy from Campbell Scientific, which are the major purveyors in the US, I said, suppose you made $1 per sensor and sold 1 million of them per year just in parts of India, or if you could get you 5 million a year, would you be interested? And we said, no, we don't have the capacity to do that. We would rather sell 10,000 and make $100 on each of them. So that's sort of the world we are dealing with. But I finally landed on somebody in Australia who said that he had started fooling around with this with his kid. So he made a device, the picture of the device is on the top left, it's called Full Stop, and it's a very ingenious device. He just takes a regular funnel, he sticks a tube in there, and the outer tube is just for protection. So the inner tube is in there, and basically what he has is a rod that goes through there, which can float. So he puts this in the soil. Once the soil is wet, as the water is coming down and the wetting front comes through here, this water comes in here, it goes into the bottom of this thing, it makes the little rod float up, and when it pops up, the farmer knows to stop watering. To add to it, he adds a little tube here to extract water samples so that he can measure nitrogen. He says it costs him $5 to make this, but he won't sell it for less than $20. Okay. So this is what you deal with when you deal with such people. They don't get what needs to be done, but he's done a full set of experiments here, very much in line with what we are interested in. And what he shows is that you get a reduction of about 30% in fertilizer application. You get a reduction of about 30% in water application. And all that is done with basically one such device out there. Okay? So the thing that I wanted to convey with this was that farmers want something that is consistent with their business model. It's red, yellow, green. Okay? The direction that the industry is going in is to add a whole bunch of electronics, have them transmit to a variety of people who will then sit there, look at also at remote sensing images from NASA satellites, and tell individual farmers what to do. Millions and millions of farmers will receive this information by cell phones, and then they will act on it. It's a new version of command and control for nerdy engineers, and I'm not sure if that's going to happen. But maybe the engineers like Vijay, who are actually interested in practical solutions, will help us get to this particular point.
Thank you very much, all speakers. I'd like to invite you to sit behind the table, and we have time for some questions. I realize that altogether this is quite a bit of listening. On the other hand, we have alternation between speakers, and I think that helps sustain the attention. So the floor is open. Questions to any of our speakers?
Decision maker, right? So the farmer goes out to the field every single day. If there's a device out there that he can see, he can look at the leaves of the plant. He has a pretty good correlation in his mind as to what he's doing. If you're doing it through satellite, it's kind of interesting because you're looking at farmers who are farming an acre or 2 acres. The footprint of anything you're estimating from the satellite is quite different. If you're going to go looking at the plant, I would say if you can get some measure of whether or not the plant is starting to wilt or what the moisture deficit in the plant is, that may be more useful than measuring ET. ET is simply a proxy for the functioning of the plant, right? So that would be my answer.
And also, the direction you said you're going to let it dry out, you're going to let the soil dry out, and then put water back. Isn't that going to cause problems with salt?
So in all schemes that try to save water in terms of irrigation application, you face this. If you do drip, you eventually have to do a soil flushing application also. Here, what we are thinking is that, for example, with rice, just like John was saying, you are ending up keeping the soil more or less saturated. So it's a 15 kilopascal trigger is what the Punjab Agricultural University soil scientist has worked with us. For wheat or cotton, it's 35. So you can actually cycle things a bit more. My anticipation is by using the start-stop mechanism, you'll be watering much more often, but much less. Okay? If you only have the start application, you'll be watering much more but less frequently compared to the current situation.
My last question is, how is the gene or transgenic crops are, affecting you in the research and what's going to go on with productivity and water use?
We haven't dealt with that ourselves, but the main experience with that is with GM cotton in the places in India we are working with. They are getting an interesting bifurcation in the sense that they have lower pesticide application, they have lower water use in the field of the farmer who's using it for cotton. Yeah, there is no experience with those. Cotton is the main one. Vijay, do you know?
I'm only cotton.
Yeah.
Because of Gujarat, that's...
Yeah. The other thing I was going to add was, but the farmers who have fields adjoining the GM cotton field, they are complaining loudly because their pests are basically attacking their crops.
And on those ceramic, the fencing around those ceramic tips, I think, years ago when I was at Cornell, when I was doing things, we've always had problems with those.
Right.
They have to be clean, they're never accurate, and they just never gave the right information.
Right, yeah. No, this is basically why we want to go to an electrically based device.
Any response other than can panel to the second question? Okay, other questions? I have a question.
Oh, here's one.
Wait for the microphone.
Hello, hi. I have a question regarding the use of tensiometers and maybe some other mechanical uses or other mechanical mechanisms to measure the water content in the soil. I know that in rice it may be a bit difficult regarding the saturation of water in the soil, but I don't know, maybe use some drills or soil pits and teach the agriculturists to do that. I know that is used in other type of crops, but I don't know if that can be applicable to what you were talking about. And maybe, I don't know, reduce the cost in the tensiometers.
One of the techniques that the International Rice Research Institute is using to reduce water use is called alternative wetting and drying. So what they basically do is place in the soil a plastic tube. It's about 4 inches diameter. The lower part of that is perforated so water can enter into the tube. And basically they flood the field, then they let it drain until the water table is 15 centimeters below the soil surface. You can see it then with this, where it is with this little tube device, and then you re-irrigate. So that's a simple way of sort of measuring. And they basically also will save 30–40% in terms of water use.
Maybe I'll ask mine then while others come up with other questions. The difference between Bangladesh and India. It's the first time, Vijay, that I heard why India had this heavy subsidy. Why do you think, does anyone have an idea why this didn't happen in Bangladesh? And maybe that may be a reason that you don't have the same volume of pumping, groundwater pumping.
So I can comment about, and I had actually a slide, I wish I had showed it, of a map of what parts of India have electricity pumps and what don't. What is very interesting is that the parts of India which, according to Manu's map, showed are very suitable for rice, which are parts of Bihar, Orissa, West Bengal and Assam, actually don't have that pervasive electricity infrastructure in the rural areas. So I don't know about Bangladesh as much, but the eastern part of India also is also the part where there was no electricity infrastructure. What little irrigation is through diesel pumps, but since the groundwater level is shallower, maybe the cost of irrigation wasn't that high. So that's,
I'll just add one comment which is speculative actually. I think the difference is democracy versus lack of democracy.
Yeah, I could maybe add that in Bangladesh, most of the shallow tube wells are actually small diesel pumps. And there's, it's pretty easy to install these wells, and farmers can move them around a lot if they need to. There is an issue with the government now promoting what they call deeper tube wells. They're not really deep, they're about little less than 300 feet, but they require a submersible pump with electricity, and they have problems with the electricity supply not being adequate for that.
And Holly, what do you think about that plan to start pumping from 300 feet with electrical pumps?
Yeah, it would definitely affect the hydrology of the system. So, yeah, in terms of arsenic, I don't think it would be, there may not be arsenic at that depth. That's about 100 meters in some places, but it certainly would draw the arsenic down because it's fairly shallow, and that much pumping would change the flow paths.
So John, what is the motivation for the government to provide this?
Well, initially, I think it was that you could have a larger command area, so you could serve more people, and I think they were concerned about the parts of the country where in the dry season the shallow aquifer is actually, the water table is dropping too low. So that's one area that we actually work in with this raised beds, is to try and work with these deep tube well command areas to use less water, and then they could irrigate more of their command area.
Questions?
Can I comment one thing, Lex, on your question? I mean, it is important to recognize that today the cost of the same unit of power from diesel is roughly 3 or 4 times that from grid electricity, which is powered either by coal or hydro. So as groundwater tables get deeper, it would, for example, in the part of Gujarat I described, agriculture would be impossible today with diesel.
Because the pumps stay above the ground. Yeah. Zaya, question?
Thank you. My question is about the low water yields that you alluded to, and how they had a lower yield overall, but they required less water. Is that uniform for other major crops like wheat and corn, where there are sort of commercially viable options that use significantly less water? And did you have any estimates for sort of the trade-off between yield and water for these major crops?
We were talking specifically about rice, and obviously if you grow wheat in Bangladesh in that same dry season, you'll irrigate it a maximum of 3 times, and in most cases twice. So you're not having the soil nearly as moist. The problem with rice is, well, partly the physiology of the plant and the breeding that has gone towards that type of physiology, and the fact that the rooting system is pretty shallow in the soil, whereas with wheat and maize the roots go deeper and they can access water that is deeper in the soil. So rice is sort of unique as a crop plant. It's the only one that we grow in a flooded environment, basically.
So there aren't really options to switch, to make that trade-off, yield for water?
Well, from what we've learned, I think that trade-off is at a very abrupt point. We're not quite exactly sure where that would be, but it's generally pretty difficult for farmers to manage where you're close to a precipice. They want to be far away from it. So, but that's, when you start talking about trade-offs between water and food, that's at the national level, countries really want food security, and whatever it costs to get that, by and large, I think they're sort of willing to invest in that.
We have one more question in front. Peter?
Manu, you showed this graph of leveling off water use, and it was pretty much the way I could see it was a little bit small labeling here, the past 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So, but we are still drawing too much, right? Although it's leveling off. So how much would we have to decrease the use? So, you know, coming down from that plateau to lower levels to get into a quote-unquote balance with nature, pretty much getting the water balance in tune with what is provided.
You mean in the Ogallala Aquifer is what you're asking
in the US in general, but you could take the Ogallala as an example.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, it's a question of choices because, you know, which things do you want to cut? Because if you cut meats out, you know, basically beef, then you see a very strong reduction overall very quickly. And the reality is that beef and pork have actually gone up in the last 10 to 20 years rather than gone down. Other than that, because the biggest user in that sense is alfalfa. The other big thing that happened in the last decade, which was a counter-directional move, was biofuels. But I think that story has died or is dying. So if you see, the reason it's hard to answer is what we would like to do is the same optimization in the US for what to grow where that we have done in India. Then I can answer your question more effectively because it could turn out that by displacing where things are grown, you know, what I did mention in the India example is we did not allow an increase in crop area or irrigated area, district by district. So it's a pretty hard constraint, spatially distributed constraint. So if we did the same thing in the US, and maybe you want to even say you have to reduce Colorado and Nebraska out, you know, because the average amount of irrigated water application in those states is about 4 feet. Whereas if you get out to the southeast, it's closer to about 1 to 1.5 feet or so. And in the northeast, it's about 0.6 feet of irrigation application. So clearly there's room to grow stuff here, and you know, you could increase irrigation here, and you could reduce it in the Midwest, and you'd be okay. The biggest lesson you get out of a country as geographically large as the United States is that scale really helps because you can average across these instances. So if you had a global free market on these things, then I think that would actually smooth out the water problem globally a fair amount. But as long as there are country issues involved, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that you know, the scope is there for substantial reductions, substantial efficiency improvements and substantial reductions in use through optimizing on these things. So I think that's overblown. 10 years ago or 5 years ago when we started looking at this stuff, I was not convinced of that. Today I'm much more convinced.
Okay, can I comment on Peter's question? In the Indian context, we are still so far from the yield potentials. Yeah. And the use of water is so inefficient that it is not inconceivable to get a factor 4 increase in food per unit water. So, in interesting way, my feeling is that the Indian government's emphasis on what they call food security, which is very important, but the way it manifests itself is in this command and control approach of fixing prices, not allowing farmers to sell land, free electricity, you can't do this, you can't, you know, is actually preventing us potentially from getting to that point. So I think that what I think is the debate that needs to be had is whether the way food security is manifested in policies, are they actually preventing us to quickly reach to efficient points of high production, less water, high value, rather fast? It will of course involve fewer farmers probably, and they're transitioning to something else. I think we are not looking at that picture as a whole.
I guess I should add, I would say the bigger threat is mega droughts rather than running out, because the things that Vijay is talking about, there's a time scale over which you can correct. So the long term, I'm not worried. But on the current practices, if you get hit with mega droughts in a couple of places, you're simply not ready for it, dealing with that.
Okay, I think it's time to end this session. Let's thank our speakers again for telling us about both, laying out the problems, various problems, and proposing some solutions. The next session in this series, we haven't quite decided the theme yet, is scheduled for January 26th. So hope to see you in about